Grieving the loss of her husband, a retired teacher finds unexpected purpose when she begins helping a nonverbal boy at the park, only to discover he's the son she was forced to give up decades ago. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The kettle screamed in the kitchen, but Claire didn't move. She stared out the window above the sink, watching the branches of the maple tree sway gently in the early morning breeze. The house, once filled with laughter and little routines, felt cavernous now. Too many quiet corners, too many echoes. It had been 3 months since David passed, and still she found herself setting 2 mugs on the counter, waiting for his footsteps that never came. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, heavy, the kind that wrapped around her shoulders like a wet blanket, and made everything feel slower, harder. Even her tea tasted different. Bitter, like it had sat too long. Maybe it had. The photo on the mantel still showed them on their last trip. David grinning in his flannel jacket, wind whipping through his silver hair. She couldn't bring herself to move it, couldn't bring herself to touch his slippers, still tucked neatly beneath the ottoman, like he might walk in at any moment and ask what was for dinner. Claire wandered into the hallway, her hand trailing along the wall, like she was trying to feel for something solid. Her days were filled with too much space now, too many hours where no one needed her, no students to guide, no husband to check on. She had spent her whole life being useful, teaching, caring, loving. Now she just existed. In the bedroom, sunlight fell in strips across the neatly made bed. She hadn't slept on her side since the funeral. She couldn't. The dip in the mattress had vanished, as though time had erased even his impression. A bird chirped outside, loud and bright against the stillness. Claire stood there for a moment, holding her breath, and then let it go. She needed to get out of the house, just for a little while. Maybe the park, maybe somewhere with color, with sound, somewhere that didn't feel like a museum of what used to be. She pulled on her cardigan, the one David always said made her look like a librarian in a good way, and stepped outside. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing the silence in. Claire walked with her hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan, the morning air still holding on to the last of the night's chill. Maplewood Park was just a 10-minute stroll from her house, a path she'd walked more times than she could count. But today it felt different, like she wasn't walking toward anything, just away from everything inside the house. The silence there was too much. Out here, at least the birds still sang. The breeze still rustled the trees. The sidewalk wound through neat rows of dogwoods and lilacs, their blooms just starting to open for spring. She used to come here with David on Saturdays, coffee in hand, pointing out squirrels like they were some rare species. He always whistled a little tune as they walked, something soft and familiar, the kind of sound that made her feel like everything was exactly as it should be. Now, without it, the air felt off-key. At the park's edge, the playground creaked with early visitors. A toddler squealed with delight on the slide while his mother checked her phone. A jogger passed by, offering a quick nod. Claire smiled politely, then took a seat on one of the weathered benches near the swing set. It groaned slightly under her weight, as though it too remembered. The grass was still damp from last night's rain, and the clouds above looked undecided, half sunlight, half storm. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, trying to breathe past the tightness in her chest. She didn't know what she was looking for here. Peace? Distraction? Maybe just proof that the world was still turning without David in it. A dog barked in the distance. A child laughed. Life carried on, even when hers felt paused. Claire opened her eyes and let her gaze wander. That's when she saw him, a little boy, sitting alone near the swing set. His back was to her, but something about the way he sat, so still, so centered in a world that rarely slowed down, caught her attention. He didn't move, didn't glance around, just stared ahead like the world beyond the park didn't matter. Something stirred in her. Not recognition, not yet. Just curiosity. And a sudden pull she couldn't explain. The boy was small, maybe 6 or 7, and sat perched on the middle swing, legs bent just enough to keep his feet from dragging. The swing didn't move far, just a gentle back and forth motion, like he wasn't trying to go higher, just trying to feel something steady, something safe. He didn't look at the other children, didn't seem to notice the laughter around him or the plastic clatter of the nearby seesaw. His whole world was the slow rhythm of that swing and the ground beneath his shoes. Claire watched from her bench, hands folded in her lap. There was something hypnotic about him, the way he repeated the same motion, the same pace, over and over. No smile, no frown, just quiet focus. His dark curls bounced slightly with each swing, and every so often he'd glance at his fingers, holding them out like he was measuring invisible threads. He didn't seem lost, just locked into a different kind of world. She glanced around, half expecting a parent nearby, but saw no one close. A few adults lingered by the walking path, chatting and sipping coffee, but no one seemed particularly attuned to the boy. Claire's instinct as a teacher stirred, something in the set of his shoulders, the way he avoided eye contact even with the wind, told her he wasn't just shy. He was retreating, managing. She'd seen it before, in children who found the world too loud and too unpredictable. The swing creaked slightly with each movement, back, forward, back, forward. The boy's lips moved, barely, but no sound came. Maybe a song, maybe a thought. Claire couldn't tell, but she didn't look away. He was beautiful in the way children are when they think no one is watching, unfiltered, unmasked. Her heart tightened. He reminded her of something, of someone, but the memory was like a smudge on glass, there but not clear enough to touch. A breeze kicked up, carrying the scent of cut grass and something faintly floral. The boy didn't flinch, just kept swinging, eyes fixed on something far beyond the playground. And Claire, for reasons she didn't understand yet, couldn't bring herself to look away. Claire shifted on the bench, her eyes drifting from the boy to the edge of the playground where a man stood, stiff-backed and silent beneath the shade of a sycamore. He wore a charcoal windbreaker, one hand tucked into the pocket, the other holding a disposable coffee cup. He didn't seem interested in drinking. His gaze was locked on the boy, not distracted, not bored, just vigilant, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. There was no smile, no wave, not even a nod when the boy glanced his way. But the child didn't seem bothered by the distance. He didn't look for approval, didn't search the man's face for reassurance. It was a quiet understanding between them, the kind that didn't need words, or perhaps never had them to begin with. Claire couldn't help but study the man a little longer. His face was drawn, tired in the way people get when life has pressed in on them from too many sides. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Sharp features, stubble that looked like it had become permanent. There was a story in his shoulders, some burden that weighed him down even when he stood tall. She recognized the posture. She carried some of that weight herself. Every so often he'd shift his stance, glance at his watch, then back to the boy. Not impatient, just careful, always calculating. Claire wondered if he was the father. He didn't look like a man used to children, no softness, no ease in the way he observed the world around the swing set. More like someone learning the steps of a dance he never expected to be a part of. Protective, yes, but distant, like he wasn't sure how close was too close. The boy continued his slow, steady swing, unaware of the conversation happening silently between the two adults who weren't speaking. Claire's fingers curled around the edge of the bench. She didn't know their names, didn't know their story, but something about the space between them, the man watching, the boy swaying alone, felt achingly familiar, as if she were witnessing the echo of something she once lived or lost. Claire noticed the toy the day after the boy first caught her attention. It lay in the mulch under the swing set, a small red truck, scuffed and missing one of its wheels. Forgotten, maybe, or abandoned. She glanced around, but no child claimed it, and the boy, as usual, sat quietly in his gentle rhythm, his eyes somewhere far away. She didn't touch it that day, but when she returned home, the image of the broken truck tugged at her, a tiny, persistent thread unraveling something inside. Maybe it was the way it mirrored the boy, silent, still, not whole. Or maybe she just needed something to fix. That night, she pulled out an old shoebox from the closet, the one where David used to keep spare screws and bits of wire. Things too good to toss, he'd always say. She worked at the kitchen table with a magnifying glass and a pair of tweezers, her hands remembering the patience that came from decades of helping children with science projects and broken lunchboxes. It wasn't perfect, but the wheel held. The next morning, she slipped the repaired truck into her canvas bag and headed back to the park, heart thudding for reasons she didn't fully understand. The boy was there, as she'd hoped, alone on the swing, his movements as measured and consistent as before. The man stood beneath the same tree, arms crossed, eyes watchful. Claire approached slowly, not wanting to startle the boy. She crouched near the edge of the swing set and placed the truck in the soft mulch, not close enough to interrupt, but near enough to be seen. Then she backed away and sat on the bench, heart tight in her chest. For several minutes, nothing happened. The swing creaked. A bird chirped overhead. The boy didn't look at the toy. Then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, he let the swing slow, slid off, and walked to where the truck lay. He knelt beside it, turning it in his small hands, examining the fixed wheel. No smile, no words. But he held it carefully, like it mattered. Claire felt her breath catch. It wasn't much, just a toy. But in that moment, it felt like something opening, a door, a beginning. The mornings had taken on a new rhythm. Claire arrived at the park with a quiet sense of purpose now, her steps lighter, her heart no longer weighed entirely by grief. The boy, always in the same spot swinging gently, had begun to notice her. He didn't speak, he never did. But his eyes followed her as she sat on the bench, as if acknowledging her presence with a silent nod. Each day she brought something small, a book with thick, colorful pages, a bouncy ball. Once a handful of dandelions she placed neatly in a row beside the swing. He never reacted the way typical children did. No laughter, no reaching. But he noticed. She could tell by the way his fingers paused mid-swing, his gaze drifting briefly toward the gift before resuming his motion. Today she brought nothing, just herself. The sky was overcast, a thin layer of gray stretching overhead, softening the light. She sat on the bench as always, folding her hands in her lap, content to simply be near him. After a while he stopped swinging, stepped off the seat with slow precision, like stepping on the ground required extra thought. His little red truck, now faded from days in the sun, was clutched tightly in his hand. Claire didn't speak. She barely breathed. He walked toward her, not directly, but in a gentle arc, like a leaf drifting in the wind. When he stopped beside the bench, he didn't look at her, just stood close enough that she could feel his presence, warm and tentative. Then, carefully, he reached out and touched the back of her hand with his fingers. It was the lightest touch, brief, delicate, but filled with something unspoken. Claire froze, her throat tightening. Her hands, which had held so many children's hands over the years, hadn't felt that particular kind of electricity in a long, long time. She looked at him. His eyes were fixed ahead, lips parted slightly, like he was listening to something only he could hear, but his fingers stayed. A connection, quiet and fragile, but real. And in that moment, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in years, not just warmth, but hope. The next morning, Claire arrived at the park earlier than usual. The air was still damp with dew and the grass shimmered in the soft light. She carried a thermos of tea and a small book of animal illustrations, something gentle, something she thought he might like. But mostly she came with questions she hadn't dared ask before. The boy was already there, as always, perched on the swing, legs tucked up like he belonged to the wind. His little red truck sat in the dirt beside him, its wheels tracing faint circles in the mulch as it rocked gently with each of his movements. Claire took her place on the bench without a word, letting the stillness settle around them. After a few minutes, she opened the book in her lap and flipped to a page with a fox curled under a tree. She turned it slightly, placing it beside her on the bench where he could see if he looked. He didn't move, but he noticed. She could feel it in the way his body leaned, ever so slightly, toward the image. That was when she heard footsteps approaching from behind, steady, slow. She turned her head just as the man, his guardian, stopped a few feet away, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the boy. "I've seen you here," he said, voice low but not unkind. Claire nodded. "He's remarkable." The man gave a small, tired chuckle. "He is." There was silence between them, stretched out like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. "I hope it's all right," Claire offered, gesturing toward the boy. "I just started sitting. I didn't mean to intrude." The man looked at her, then really looked. "He doesn't usually let people close. You must have done something right." She smiled gently. "I brought him a truck, a broken one, fixed it." He nodded once. "That would do it." Claire hesitated. "What's his name?" "Adam." The word settled into her chest like a pebble dropped in still water. "Adam." She waited. "Does he speak?" The man's eyes softened, just barely. "No, he's autistic, nonverbal, 6 years old." Claire looked back at the boy. Adam. Everything about him made more sense now, yet it only deepened the quiet connection she'd begun to feel. Not pity, not worry, just understanding. And something else, something deeper. She whispered his name like a secret. Adam. The following day, the sun hung higher in the sky, filtering through the trees in soft golden strands. Claire arrived with a thermos of peppermint tea and 2 paper cups, one for herself and one in case a quiet gesture might open a door. She wasn't expecting much. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for at all. Adam was already there, gently swaying as always, red truck held loosely in one hand, eyes on the ground. Claire gave him a soft smile as she sat. No words, just presence. That seemed to be what he understood best. She was halfway through pouring her tea when the man appeared again, footsteps crunching over gravel, hands tucked into his coat pockets. He didn't speak at first, just stood near the edge of the playground, gaze flicking from Adam to Claire with a guarded look. Claire glanced up. "Tea?" His expression didn't change, but after a long moment he nodded once and walked over, slow and measured, like someone used to disappointment. She handed him the cup. "No sugar, I'm afraid." "That's fine," he replied. His voice was flat but not cold, like someone who'd forgotten how to add warmth but remembered the shape of it. They stood there in silence for a while, both watching the boy on the swing. Claire waited, letting the moment stretch. "I'm Claire," she said finally. The man hesitated, then gave a quick nod. "Paul." It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a dismissal either. "Paul," she echoed, tasting the name. "He's lucky to have you." Paul gave a dry, short laugh. "I don't know if lucky's the right word." Claire turned slightly to face him. "You care. That's rare enough." He looked at her then, really looked. There was something heavy behind his eyes. Loss, maybe, or exhaustion worn into the bones. "I'm not his father," he said, as if needing to make it clear. "I'm family. Sort of. His parents, my brother and sister-in-law, passed about a year ago. I took guardianship." Claire felt a pang deep in her chest. That's a big responsibility. Paul stared down into his cup. "It's not one I expected, but it's the only one that mattered." And in the silence that followed, something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. The days folded into one another like pages in a well-worn book. Morning light stretched longer, birds sang louder, and Claire found herself at Maplewood Park more often than not, her thermos tucked under one arm and a scarf knotted loosely at her neck. The bench, their bench now it seemed, was usually empty when she arrived, but it never stayed that way for long. Adam would already be swinging, always that same gentle rhythm, his red truck faithfully by his side. And Paul would appear minutes later, sometimes with a coffee, sometimes without, but always with that steady watchfulness that never wavered. At first they barely spoke, a nod, a polite hello. Silence, thick but not uncomfortable, settled between them like an old friend. Claire didn't push. She knew the value of quiet, but slowly fragments began to slip through the stillness. "Does he always swing that long?" she asked one day, her eyes following the arc of Adam's motion. Paul gave a short shrug. "It calms him, helps him sort the world out, I think." Another morning Paul sat down beside her without a word, rubbing the back of his neck like sleep hadn't come easy. Claire offered him a second cup from her thermos, and he took it with a quiet, "Thanks." They didn't talk much about themselves, but now and then details slipped through. He used to line up all his toy animals by color, Paul mentioned one cloudy afternoon. If one was missing, he wouldn't sleep. Claire smiled softly. "I had a student like that once, 3rd grade. He wouldn't touch a crayon unless it came from the red bin." Paul nodded. Routine matters, especially now. Another day. "Do you miss teaching?" "I miss the kids more than the job. They made everything feel alive." "Yeah," Paul said, glancing toward Adam. "That sounds about right." Their words were small, scattered like breadcrumbs. But they were beginning to form a trail, not toward friendship, maybe not yet, but toward familiarity, toward something human in the middle of all that loss. And always in the background, Adam swayed, constant, quiet, and watching. It was a Tuesday when it happened. The sky hung low with heavy clouds, the kind that muted the world in soft grays. Claire had come to the park later than usual, a little off rhythm after a restless night. But Adam was there, waiting, as if time held a space just for him on that swing. She offered her usual quiet smile, settling onto the bench beside Paul without a word. He gave a slight nod in return, his eyes never leaving the boy. Claire followed his gaze, and that's when she saw it. Adam had stopped swinging. He sat still, the red truck resting in his lap, his hands holding it without movement. His eyes weren't blank or distracted. No, they were fixed on her, focused, present, and in them was something that caught her breath, a flicker of something unspoken, something deeper than curiosity. Claire's heart stilled. It wasn't just the look, it was the way he looked, a tilt of the head, the slight furrow in his brow, the way his bottom lip trembled ever so slightly, like he was fighting something inside, unsure whether to reach out or retreat. She'd seen that expression before, once, a lifetime ago, in a hospital room painted soft yellow, when a nurse had gently placed a newborn in her arms, a baby with dark curls and eyes far too knowing for his age. He'd looked up at her with that same wide-eyed intensity, the same quiet ache that said, "Don't leave me." Claire blinked hard, her breath catching in her throat. It was impossible, nonsensical. And yet her chest clenched like it remembered what her mind refused to believe. She looked away, pressing her palms to her lap. Paul didn't notice. He was sipping his coffee, his eyes on the horizon. And Adam had turned his gaze back to the ground, gently rolling his truck back and forth as if the moment had passed. But for Claire, it hadn't. That look stayed with her even as she walked home in the cooling wind. It lingered through dinner, through the quiet clink of dishes, through the ache in her bones that told her the past doesn't always stay buried. And sometimes it looks you right in the eye. The tea shop on Pine Street was nearly empty, the soft clatter of cups and the gentle hum of conversation creating a cocoon of privacy. Claire sat across from her oldest friend, Mary Ann, the kind of woman who always wore statement earrings and spoke in crisp, honest sentences. They had met in college, taught in the same district for years, and weathered each other's storms, divorces, funerals, retirement. Still, Claire had never told her this, not all of it. "I've been spending time at the park," Claire said, stirring her chamomile tea, even though it needed nothing. Marianne raised an eyebrow, smiling faintly. "Meeting someone?" Claire let out a soft laugh. "No, not like that. There's a little boy there. His name's Adam. I've been drawn to him. He's different. He's quiet, doesn't speak. But something about him, it just won't let me go." Marianne's smile faded into curiosity, her spoon pausing mid-stir. "Drawn how?" Claire hesitated. The words felt heavy, like they'd been packed away in a box for decades, never meant to see daylight. But lately the box had been rattling. And now, with Adam's eyes still etched into her memory, the lid wouldn't stay shut. "When I was 16, Claire said, barely above a whisper, "I had a baby." Marianne's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. "I was scared. My parents were strict, ashamed. They said we'd ruin everything. So I never held him, not really. I was allowed one moment, just one. Then they took him. I signed the papers, and he was gone." The silence between them stretched, thick with emotion. Claire didn't look up. She stared into her tea like it could swallow the years. "I never told anyone, not even David. I thought I could move on, build a life, leave it in the past." Marianne reached across the table, her hand resting over Claire's. "And now you see him in this boy?" Claire nodded slowly. "It's probably nothing, just my heart looking for ghosts." But even as she said it, the words felt like a lie, because something in her knew, deep in her bones, deep in the part of her that had never stopped aching, that the past might be sitting quietly on a swing, waiting to be found. The sidewalk beneath the swings had turned into a canvas. At first it was just a few scattered lines, chalk marks that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Claire did. She always noticed the small things, the quiet things, and Adam's drawings weren't random, not to her. Each morning now he arrived with a small bucket of sidewalk chalk in muted colors, soft blues, grays, and the occasional pale yellow. While other children darted between the jungle gym and slides, Adam would crouch near the concrete path, fingers smudged with dust, head bowed in focus. Spirals. Over and over again he drew swirling, hypnotic spirals. Not wild, not chaotic, perfectly measured circles that widened outward like tiny galaxies, some large, others no bigger than her palm, but always in that same shade of blue. He never explained them, never acknowledged her when she approached. He just kept drawing, his world reduced to loops and curves that spun like clockwork. Claire watched him from the bench, heart tight with a kind of wonder, laced in sadness. The chalk dust clung to his fingertips, a hint of color on his skin. She wanted to ask what it meant, what he saw when he drew them, but she didn't want to break the spell. She knew how sacred some silences could be. One day he paused in his work, his fingers hovering over a fresh spiral, and glanced up at her. His eyes, wide and unblinking, held her gaze for just a breath. Then he pointed, softly, deliberately, at the spiral nearest her feet. Claire looked down. It was different. Inside the center of the blue swirl, he had pressed the yellow chalk in a single, faint dot, like a sun buried at the core of a storm. She bent down slowly, not sure what to say, but drawn to the image like a tether. "It's beautiful, Adam," she said gently. He didn't react, just picked up his chalk and started again, but Claire's chest stirred with something she couldn't name. The spirals were more than drawings. They were messages, patterns, a language she didn't yet understand, but desperately wanted to. Claire hadn't planned anything special. She'd simply woken that morning with a small ache behind her ribs and the thought that maybe, just maybe, a treat would lift the mood she couldn't quite shake. So she baked. Vanilla cupcakes with a swirl of pale blue frosting, the kind she used to bring in on Fridays for her students, back when small joys still had the power to light up a classroom. She boxed them carefully, placed them in her canvas tote, and made her way to the park. The sky was crisp and clear, the kind of spring day that hinted at warmth but still carried a bite in the breeze. Adam was already there, crouched near the swing set, chalk in hand, drawing another spiral, this one wider, slower, his fingers pausing between lines as if he were thinking carefully. Claire smiled as she approached the bench. Paul stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, watching Adam with the usual quiet intensity. "I brought cupcakes," she said softly, holding the box up just enough for him to see. Paul blinked, taken off guard. "Today?" She nodded. "I thought it might be nice. No reason, really." Something shifted in his face. Not alarm, not displeasure, just something unreadable. He looked down at the box, then at Adam. "You didn't know?" Claire tilted her head. "Know what?" Paul exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's his birthday. Today." The words hit her like a whisper that somehow carried weight. Her hand stilled on the box as she looked toward the boy. "I had no idea." Paul shook his head gently. "Neither did he. We don't make a big thing of it. Too much stimulation. It's hard for him." Claire hesitated. "Should I not?" But before she could finish, Adam stood. He walked to her slowly, eyes locked on the box. He didn't speak, he didn't smile, but he reached out, both hands open, trembling, and touched the edge of the container, his fingers brushing the wax paper like it was something sacred. Claire knelt, opening it carefully. "Happy birthday, Adam," she whispered. His eyes filled suddenly, silently, with tears. No sobbing, no sound, just wide, overwhelmed eyes, and a single tear tracing his cheek as he looked at the cupcakes, like he was seeing something meant only for him. And in that moment, Claire's heart broke and bloomed all at once. Claire couldn't sleep. The house, usually quiet, felt suffocating tonight. Too still, too hollow. The ticking of the old mantel clock struck louder in the dark, and every creak of the floorboards upstairs sent ripples of memory down her spine. She lay in bed with the sheets pulled up to her chest, staring at the ceiling, the soft glow of the street lamp outside casting a ghostly light across the room. The image of Adam, eyes full of quiet sorrow, fingers gently touching the cupcake box, wouldn't leave her. It had settled deep, like a stone dropped in still water. His face, that fragile awe, had stirred something too old and too buried to ignore. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 17 again. The hospital had smelled like antiseptic and starch. The walls had been too white, the air too cold. Her body, still aching from the birth, had trembled as she clutched the baby wrapped in a blue cotton blanket. He was so small, barely more than a breath in her arms. Dark curls, a button nose, and tiny fists that waved as if grasping for something unseen. His cries were soft, almost hesitant, like he didn't know if he was allowed to be here. Claire had named him James, though no one else ever called him that. She had whispered it to him in those precious few minutes before they took him. James, her son. Her mother had stood by the door, arms folded, face carved from stone. "It's for the best," she'd said, voice devoid of warmth. "You're just a child. You wouldn't survive raising one." No room for pleading, no space for second thoughts. Claire had kissed his forehead and tried to memorize every detail. His scent, the weight of him, the way his fingers curled instinctively around hers. Then they took him, and she never saw him again, until now. She sat up suddenly, swinging her legs over the side of the bed, her chest heaving. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. And yet, there in the quiet of her empty room, Claire felt the tremor of something undeniable. What if Adam wasn't just any boy? What if he was James? It was late afternoon, and the wind had picked up just enough to rustle the leaves across the park paths in soft, skipping patterns. Claire sat on the bench, her scarf pulled snug around her neck, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Adam was drawing again, his chalk spirals growing more intricate, now layered with loops of soft yellow and gray. Paul stood a few paces behind his usual spot. Closer today, less guarded. Claire noticed it without looking directly at him, sensed it in the way his shoulders didn't seem as tense, his steps less cautious. After a while, he sat beside her, sighing like he was trying to let something go, but didn't know where to begin. Claire didn't speak. She'd learned by now that silence was sometimes the best invitation. Paul watched Adam for a long time, his gaze distant, full of something deeper than worry. "He's not biologically mine," he said quietly. "I guess I never actually said that, did I?" Claire looked over, giving him her full attention, though her expression remained gentle, open. "No, you didn't." Paul nodded slowly. "My brother and his wife adopted him as an infant. I didn't even know they were trying to adopt until they brought him home. It was a closed adoption, no details shared. I met Adam when he was a few days old. I didn't know anything about kids, but he had this way of just being there, you know?" She nodded. She did. "They were good parents," he continued. "Better than I expected. But last year, a car accident." He paused. "Killed them both. No warning. Just gone." Claire's breath caught softly. "I'm so sorry." He nodded again, jaw tightening. "They'd named me guardian in their will. I think they knew I wouldn't turn my back on him, and I haven't. I won't. But I wasn't ready for this. I had to sell my place, move closer to the therapists, the school. Start over." Claire looked toward Adam, who was now sitting cross-legged, tracing a spiral with his fingertip. "You're doing better than you think," she said softly. Paul gave a dry smile. "I hope so. Some days I'm just trying not to screw him up more than the world already has." Claire placed her hand gently on the bench between them, not touching him but close. "He's lucky to have you," she said. Paul didn't answer, but he stayed beside her, and for the first time didn't seem in a hurry to leave. The hospital looked different than she remembered, sleeker now, all glass panels and sterile white walls, a new wing jutting out like a polished promise of progress. But beneath it, Claire could still feel the weight of the past. The brick bones of the old maternity ward were still intact, tucked at the back like a secret the new building didn't talk about. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor as she walked toward the records office, heart pounding, in a rhythm she hadn't felt since her youth. She clutched her handbag tight, as if holding on to something solid could quiet the tremble in her hands. Part of her still couldn't believe she was doing this. But the memory of Adam, those wide eyes, those familiar spirals, had shattered whatever wall she'd spent decades building. The clerk at the desk was young, barely out of college, typing with mechanical focus. Claire waited politely, then cleared her throat. "I'm looking for maternity records," she said, voice low. "From 1984. The woman blinked, surprised. "That's quite a ways back. Do you have a patient name?" "Yes," Claire said softly. "Claire Marie Whitaker. I was 17. I gave birth here. The baby was placed for adoption." There was a pause, the kind that fell too long between strangers when grief is unexpectedly laid bare. The woman nodded, professional mask slipping into something kinder. "We don't keep paper files on site anymore, but archived records are still stored digitally. I'll check." Claire stood there, still as stone. As the woman typed and scrolled, every second felt like a year. Finally, the clerk spoke again. "There's a file. It's sealed, but there's a note. It was a closed adoption, arranged privately through a law firm. No identifying information, just a delivery record, weight, time of birth." Claire's mouth went dry. "Is there anything else?" The woman hesitated. "There's a code here, hospital tracking ID. Sometimes that connects to the adoption agency records, if those still exist, but I can't access them. You'd need to petition for release of information through family court." Claire nodded, barely hearing. Her mind was already racing, her body trembling in the quiet. She had a name, a date, a thread, and after all these years, that was more than she'd ever expected to hold again. The next day, Claire returned to the hospital, the air outside sharp with the bite of early spring. She clutched a manila folder in her arms, papers she'd dug out of a fireproof box in her basement the night before. Faded documents, her own hospital bracelet, a discharge form, and the only copy she had of the original birth certificate. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for. Confirmation? Closure? Maybe just to prove to herself that the feeling, that unshakable sense that Adam was hers, wasn't entirely imagined. The same young clerk was on duty. When she saw Claire, she stood a little straighter, as if bracing for a difficult ask. "I know these things are sealed," Claire said gently, setting the folder on the counter, "but I was hoping you could help me match something. I'm not asking for names, just cross-reference." The clerk hesitated. "You know we're not supposed to give out identifying information." "I'm not trying to find his family," Claire said, her voice tight with emotion. "I think I already have. I just need to know if I'm going crazy." She opened the folder and unfolded the birth certificate. The clerk scanned it, eyes flicking to the name printed in fading ink. Baby Boy Whitaker. Date of birth, March 14th, 1984. No father listed. Claire slid the file forward. "Could you look at the case number tied to the record from yesterday? Just that. Just the case ID. I want to see if it matches." The clerk looked conflicted, lips pressing into a line. But after a moment she gave a small nod and turned to the screen. She typed slowly, carefully, then stopped. Claire watched her face change, just slightly. A flicker of something, recognition, unease. "What is it?" Claire asked. The clerk leaned closer to the monitor, then back to Claire. "I can't show you this, but the case ID on your certificate, 84317B, matches the hospital archive reference from yesterday's file." Claire's breath caught. "That's not just a connection," the clerk added softly. "That's the same file." Claire's fingers trembled as she pressed them to the edge of the counter. Adam wasn't just familiar. He wasn't just reminding her of the past. He was the past. He was her son. Claire sat in her kitchen, the ticking of the wall clock loud in the hush of early evening. The folder from the hospital lay on the table, untouched since she'd returned, but its weight pressed into her chest like an anchor. She had spent the day in a daze, alternating between disbelief and the kind of hope that felt too dangerous to trust. She wasn't a woman prone to wild ideas. Years of teaching, of raising other people's children, had taught her to trust structure, facts, the known. But no fact could explain the way Adam looked at her, or the quiet storm inside her every time he reached for her hand. She needed certainty. The DNA kit arrived 2 days later in a plain envelope, its unremarkable packaging at odds with the life-altering truth it might reveal. Claire stared at the swabs, the instructions printed in tiny, sterile text, and felt her pulse quicken. She couldn't do it alone. So she waited. The next day at the park, Adam was on the swing, chalk dust on his sleeves. Paul stood a few feet away, arms folded, brow furrowed, always watching, always quietly protective. Claire approached slowly, the envelope tucked in her bag. Her heart beat louder with each step. "Paul," she said gently. He turned to her, guarded as ever. "I need to talk to you," she added. They sat on the bench. Claire's fingers fumbled as she pulled the envelope free and held it in her lap. I think Adam might be my son," she said, voice barely audible. "The one I gave up. Decades ago. I found the birth record, the hospital file. It matches." Paul said nothing. His face didn't change, but the silence between them thickened. "I'm not trying to take him," Claire continued. "I swear to you, but I need to know." She placed the envelope between them. "Would you let him take this test? I've already done mine." Paul stared at the package, then at her. After a long, waited pause, he nodded once. "If you're right, we'll deal with it, but we do this my way." Claire blinked, stunned by the relief crashing through her. And beneath the swing set, Adam kept drawing, circles, inside circles, as though he'd known all along. The envelope was smaller than she expected, just a flat, white rectangle tucked into her mailbox like any other piece of mail. No warning, no ceremony. Claire stood on her porch holding it, her fingers numb, despite the warm afternoon sun. The label read plainly, DNA analysis results, confidential. She didn't open it right away. She brought it inside, set it carefully on the kitchen table, and made tea she wouldn't drink. Her hands trembled as she sat down, staring at the envelope like it might explode. For a moment she considered not opening it at all. Maybe it was safer not to know, to live in that tender place between doubt and hope, where her heart could still pretend it was wrong. But she was long past pretending. The truth had taken root in her. Claire tore the envelope open with a steadying breath. Inside, the paper was thin, clinical, numbers and names. Her name, Adams. Probability of maternity, 99.997%. The room tilted. She didn't cry, not at first. She just sat there, the paper in her lap, her breath shallow, chest aching with 1,000 emotions crashing all at once. Relief, grief, guilt, wonder. The impossible becoming real. Adam was her son, her baby, her James. She thought of his tiny fists, his cries that first night in the hospital, the way her mother had turned her face to stone. She thought of the years lost, the birthdays missed, the scraped knees she never got to kiss, the lullabies she never sang. And yet here he was, still hers, somehow, impossibly, after all this time. Tears came then, hot and sudden, spilling over before she could stop them. She clutched the paper to her chest, as if holding it tight might bring him closer, might give her back the years. In the next room the silence pulsed around her, but this time it didn't feel empty. This time it was full, with possibility, with truth, and with the fragile, undeniable hope that maybe it wasn't too late to be his mother, not in name, but in heart. Paul didn't say a word when she handed him the envelope. They stood by the edge of the playground, just beyond the swing set, where Adam was drawing another soft blue spiral on the pavement. The late afternoon light cast long shadows between them, but Claire felt the colder distance not in the sun, but in Paul's eyes. He read the page once, then again. His face didn't move, didn't twitch, but something behind it cracked. Claire could feel it like a shift in air pressure. The silence was loud, crushing. "I waited until I was sure," Claire said softly. "I didn't want to bring it to you without proof." Paul's jaw tightened, the paper crumpling slightly in his hand. "You should have told me the second you suspected." She started, but stopped. There was no excuse. She had waited, out of fear, out of grief, out of a need to protect something fragile and uncertain. But in doing so, she'd crossed a line. Paul finally looked at her, and the anger in his eyes wasn't loud. It was quiet and sharp, like something restrained for too long. "You sat with him, spent time with him, looked at me in the face every day while you were wondering if he was yours." Claire's voice trembled. "I didn't mean to lie, I didn't know how to carry it." "And what now?" Paul snapped. "You want to take him? Get a lawyer? Reclaim your rights like he's a misplaced suitcase?" The words hit her hard. "No," she whispered. "No, I don't want custody. I don't want to take him from you. I want to know him. I want to be in his life, if you'll let me." Paul turned away, dragging a hand through his hair. His whole body seemed to coil inward, like the weight of the truth had bent something in him. "I'm trying to do right by him," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't sign up for this. I don't know how to be what he needs. And now you show up with a past I can't compete with?" Claire stepped forward, tears stinging her eyes. "You're not supposed to compete. You've raised him. You've loved him. That doesn't disappear because I gave birth to him." But Paul stepped back, shaking his head, the distance suddenly too much to cross. "I need time," he said, his voice low. "And so does he." Then he turned and walked away, Adam following quietly beside him, spirals unfinished on the ground. and Claire, alone on the bench, felt the loss all over again. Claire stared at the blank sheet of paper for nearly an hour before she finally put pen to it. She had tried typing at first. Something about the cold click of keys had felt too distant, too detached. This needed ink. It needed her handwriting. Imperfect, shaky in places, real. She wanted Paul to feel that it came from her hands, not just her head. She began slowly, the words coming in fits and starts, each one peeling back a layer she hadn't touched in decades. Paul, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it, and I need you to have it, even if it just sits unopened in a drawer. When I was 17, I gave birth to a baby boy. His name was James. I only held him for a few minutes. I wasn't allowed more than that. My parents told me I was too young, that I wouldn't survive it. I didn't fight them hard enough. I've lived with that shame every day since. I never looked for him. I was afraid. Afraid that I'd disrupt a life that was better without me. Afraid he'd hate me if he ever found out. I buried it all under the life I built, teaching, marriage, routine. But that part of me never healed. It just stayed quiet. Then I met Adam. I didn't know it at first. I swear to you, I didn't. I was just drawn to him. Something about him felt familiar. Like a song I used to know but couldn't name. When I realized the possibility, I panicked. I didn't want to believe it because if I believed it, it would mean I'd missed everything. I didn't mean to lie to you. I just wasn't ready to face what the truth might mean. I'm not here to take him from you. You're his father in all the ways that matter most. I know that. I respect that. But I love him. I can't explain how or why, only that a part of me never stopped. I want to be in his life, even if it's just as someone who gets to sit on the bench a few feet away. I want to do this the right way, your way, with your permission. I'm sorry for keeping it from you, and I'm grateful deeply for what you've done for him. No matter what you decide, thank you for letting me know him at all. With all my heart, Claire. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and wrote his name across the front in small, steady print. Then she sealed it with hands that trembled, not from fear this time, but from hope. The park felt quieter without them. Claire still came every morning, as if not showing up would somehow confirm the loss she feared was already real. The swing where Adam used to sit remained empty, its chains rattling in the wind like a whisper of something missing. She sat on the bench with her thermos of tea and the book she rarely opened, eyes scanning the paths for any sign of them. But day after day, the bench beside her stayed empty. She didn't know if Paul had read the letter. She didn't know if he was angry or simply done. The not knowing gnawed at her more than anger ever could. She would have welcomed a slammed door, even harsh words, anything over this hollow silence. The mornings blurred into each other. Children came and went. Dogs barked. The chalk spirals near the swing slowly faded, washed away by spring rain and time. She watched them dissolve like memories, like all the things she hadn't said in time. Each day she considered not coming back, but the pull was still there, a quiet tether that wouldn't let her walk away. Sometimes she imagined Adam turning the corner, his soft footsteps padding across the mulch, his hands already smudged with chalk. She imagined his quiet approach, the light touch of his fingers on her wrist, the weightless power of that small, wordless connection. But each time it was someone else, a stranger, a passerby. Claire stayed for an hour each day, no more. She didn't want to look desperate, but the truth was, she was waiting, hoping. She'd never known silence could feel so loud, that it could stretch across days, weeks, and fill every corner of her life. Still she came, still she sat. Because in the stillness she held on to the only thing she had left, the hope that sometimes silence is not the end, but the space between one chapter and the next. It was a Thursday, bright, breezy, with clouds drifting like slow ships across the blue sky when Claire saw him again. She almost didn't believe it at first. She was halfway through pouring her tea, her thoughts lost somewhere between memory and resignation, when something in her periphery shifted. A shadow at the edge of the playground, small, familiar. Adam. He stood still for a moment near the mulch, his red truck clutched tight in one hand, the other hanging loosely at his side. His hair was a little longer, his sleeves rolled slightly too high as if someone else had dressed him in a hurry. But it was him, undeniably, unmistakably him. Claire froze. He walked slowly toward the swings, eyes scanning the area in that focused, methodical way she remembered. There was no Paul, no guardian standing nearby, just a woman in scrubs sitting on a nearby bench, probably a caretaker, watching from a distance, not interfering. Adam climbed onto the swing with careful movements, settling in like he'd never left. He didn't start swinging, though, not yet. Instead, he sat, still and straight-backed, his eyes moving steadily across the park, searching. He looked toward the bench where Claire always sat, looked again. She didn't move, barely breathed. Then, slowly, his hand tightened around the truck, and he tilted his head in the tiniest of gestures, recognition maybe, or hope. His feet brushed the dirt beneath the swing, not kicking off into motion, but grounding himself, waiting. Claire's throat tightened. She didn't approach him, not yet. She didn't want to scare him or break whatever fragile thread had brought him back, but she stayed, just like always. And Adam, still and quiet, sat in that swing like he was waiting for something, not the wind, not the routine, her. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with memory, with recognition, with the first fragile roots of something trying to grow again. Claire gripped the edge of the bench and let herself hope. This wasn't just a visit. This was Adam saying, "I remember." The next day she brought nothing but herself. No books, no chalk, no tea, just the quiet hum of her footsteps on the gravel path and the fragile, flickering hope that Adam would be there again. He was. Same swing, same red truck resting in his lap. But this time, he saw her before she even sat down. His eyes found her, and he didn't look away. He didn't wave or smile. He didn't need to. The stillness in his body softened, and that was enough. Claire settled onto the bench a few feet away, angled just slightly toward him, giving him the space he always seemed to need. The breeze carried the soft rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog. But beneath it all, a melody stirred in her chest, one she hadn't thought of in decades. She didn't even realize she was humming at first. It came without warning, quiet, soft, the way you sing to calm a baby in the middle of the night. A lullaby she'd made up when she was 17, holding her son in those first impossible moments. Wordless, simple, just 3 drifting notes that looped like a lull in the tide. Her mother had told her not to sing. "You'll make it harder," she'd said. But she'd sung anyway. Now the notes slipped from her lips, barely louder than a whisper, and for a moment the park blurred around her. Adam stilled. His fingers, which had been rolling the truck back and forth along the swing's chain, froze. Slowly he turned his head, eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. Then, without looking away, he opened his mouth and hummed. The same notes, clear, gentle. As if the tune had lived inside him all this time, Claire's hand flew to her chest, breath caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. She didn't speak, couldn't. Adam hummed again, matching her, echoing her. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't imagined, it was a memory, a connection buried deep, beyond words, beyond explanation. A song sung once in a hospital room by a scared young girl to a newborn she never got to keep. And now, all these years later, sung back to her by the boy who never forgot. It was early evening when the knock came, 3 slow, uncertain taps on the front door. Claire had been folding laundry, the soft rhythm of her old jazz records playing in the background. At first she thought she'd imagined it. No one ever came by unannounced anymore. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and moved to the door, peering through the curtain before she opened it. Paul. He stood on her porch in a wrinkled jacket, the collar turned slightly up like he'd dressed in a hurry. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a baseball cap. He looked tired, not just physically, but in the way someone looks when they've been carrying something too heavy for too long. Claire opened the door slowly. "Hi." Paul didn't speak right away. His jaw tightened, and he looked past her, as if trying to steady himself. Then he met her eyes. "I got your letter," he said. She nodded. "I wasn't sure if you'd read it." "I read it more than once." His voice was rough, but quieter than she expected. Not angry exactly, just raw. She stepped aside. "Do you want to come in?" He hesitated, then gave a curt nod and crossed the threshold. Claire led him to the living room. The air between them pulsed with all the things still unsaid. Paul remained standing, arms crossed, eyes scanning the space, like it told him something about her he hadn't known before. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and said, "Adam hummed something yesterday, a tune I'd never heard before. Said you were humming it first." Claire's eyes shimmered, her voice low. "I used to sing it to him when he was a baby. Just a silly melody I made up." Paul nodded once slowly. "He's never hummed anything before, not like that." Claire's hands trembled in her lap. "I'm not here to disrupt his life, Paul, or yours. I want to be a part of it, however you'll allow." Paul was quiet for a long moment. Then he finally spoke. "I don't know what this is supposed to look like, but I know he looks for you now." Claire swallowed hard. "I look for him too." And for the first time, Paul didn't pull away. He sat down, not ready to forgive, not yet, but willing to begin. The car ride was mostly quiet, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the cracked window. Claire gave directions softly, her voice almost hesitant, like she was guiding them through a place that still hurt to name. Paul didn't press her. He just drove, his hands steady on the wheel, eyes flicking occasionally toward her in the passenger seat. They turned off the main road onto a narrow lane lined with old maples, their branches arching above like a tunnel of time. The houses here were older, tired-looking, modest brick and siding, small front lawns with cracked walkways and leaning mailboxes. "There," Claire said quietly, pointing. The house was still standing, a squat, two-story home with peeling white paint and green shutters that had faded into gray. The porch sagged a little more than she remembered, and the garden her mother had once tended with tight-lipped precision was now overgrown with wild clover and tall, unbothered grass. Paul pulled over and cut the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. "I haven't been back here in years," Claire said, her voice just above a whisper. "Not since I left for college. Not since him." Paul looked at the house, then back at her. "This is where it happened?" Claire nodded slowly. "This is where I told my mother I was pregnant, where she told me I'd ruined everything." Her fingers tightened in her lap. "She never even let me tell him his name. James. I named him James." Paul didn't speak, but his silence felt solid, like something she could lean against. "She made all the calls, arranged the adoption. I signed the papers in that upstairs bedroom," Claire continued, her voice steady but distant. "I wasn't allowed to see the adoptive parents. My father didn't speak to me for weeks, and after I gave birth, they sent me away to finish school in another state. I came back, but things were never the same." Paul glanced up at the house again. She was trying to protect her version of the world. Claire let out a soft, bitter breath. Yes, even if it meant breaking mine. They sat there a while longer, parked just across from the house where everything had changed. No one came out. No lights flicked on. It was just a structure now, wood and brick and echoes. But for Claire, it was more. It was the place where she lost her son. And somehow, the place where she was beginning to find him again. It was late when they returned, too late for the park, too quiet for pretending this was just a casual conversation. Claire invited Paul inside without saying a word, and he accepted with the same unspoken agreement. Something had shifted between them during the drive back from her childhood home. Not entirely trust, but truth had begun to settle between them like soft dust, unavoidably present. The living room was dim, lit only by a single floor lamp in the corner. Claire poured them each a cup of tea, her movements slow, deliberate. Paul took his without protest and sat in the armchair across from her, resting the cup on his knee, untouched. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't strained. It was expectant, like a tide pulling in. Then Claire broke it. "Do you ever feel like you're holding your breath every minute you're with him? Like one wrong move might break something you don't know how to fix?" Paul let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. Every day. "I keep wondering when someone's going to figure out I don't know what the hell I'm doing." She looked at him gently. "You're doing better than most would." He shrugged. "I try, but there are nights I sit outside his room and listen just to make sure he's breathing. Mornings where I can't get him to look at me. Days when he just retreats, and I wonder if I've already lost him." Claire nodded slowly. "I wonder that too. Not with him, but with time. With all the things I missed. The birthdays. The moments that shape a child." Her voice cracked. "I've mourned him for 38 years, and now that he's here, I don't know how to reach him." Paul leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "He is reachable, but not in ways we expect. He's not going to say it. He's not going to run into your arms. But he remembers, and he chooses. Every moment he's choosing who to trust." Claire looked down at her hands. "Do you think I broke that? By keeping the truth from you?" He was quiet, then said, "No, I think you were afraid. And I think you're still here." She looked up, and in his eyes, for the first time, she saw not resistance, but possibility. "We both love him," Claire said, her voice firmer now. "That has to be enough to build something from." Paul nodded. "Then, let's build it." The sun dipped low over Maplewood Park, casting golden light across the grass and turning the shadows long and soft. It was late afternoon, the kind of quiet time when most families had already gone home for dinner, leaving the playground nearly empty. Just the three of them remained, Claire on the bench, Paul standing nearby with his arms folded, and Adam crouched over the chalk-streaked sidewalk. He'd been drawing again, spirals at first, his familiar rhythm, but then something different. He began to fill the inside of one spiral with shapes, a square, a triangle, a little circle off to the side. He kept glancing up between lines, eyes flicking toward Claire, then to Paul. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Claire leaned forward. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Adam didn't respond, but his hand paused. He looked at her, then pointed to the square he'd drawn inside the spiral. Claire followed his finger. "That looks like a house." Adam stared at it for a long moment. Then he did something neither of them expected. He opened his mouth and spoke. "Home." The word was a whisper, barely a sound, but it carried through the air like a bell. Claire froze. Paul straightened. For a heartbeat, neither of them could move. Adam looked at Claire as he said it, his voice uncertain but intentional. "Home." Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. Her eyes filled instantly, overwhelmed by the fragile beauty of that single word. "Yes," she whispered. "That's right. It's home." Paul stepped closer, his face stunned. He knelt beside Adam, his voice soft, reverent. "Adam, buddy, did you say that?" Adam didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. His hand went back to the chalk, and he drew a second house, smaller, next to the first. He placed a blue dot inside the first, a yellow one in the second. Then he looked up at them, his face calm, open. Paul swallowed hard. He's never spoken a word, not once. Claire crouched beside them, tears sliding down her cheeks. One word, one fragile, precious word. Home. And it was everything. The days began to change, not all at once, not dramatically, but with a quiet steadiness that settled into their lives like morning light filtering through curtains. Claire no longer sat alone on the bench. She arrived with Paul now, sometimes with a warm pastry wrapped in a napkin for him, or a new book tucked under her arm for Adam. They rarely needed to plan it anymore. Somehow, without ever saying it out loud, they'd all started showing up at the same time, as if their lives were slowly falling into sync. Adam still didn't speak often. After that first whispered, "home," he'd gone quiet again, as if the word had been enough, for now. But something had shifted. He stayed close, reached for Claire's hand more, rested his head on Paul's shoulder when he got tired. Sometimes he would sit between them on the park bench, a hand on each of their knees, grounding himself without words. Claire and Paul began to fall into a rhythm too. There were awkward starts, small disagreements about routine, about boundaries, about how much was too much or too soon, but nothing sharp, nothing they couldn't smooth over with time and care. One Saturday they all went to the farmer's market together. Claire bought Adam a wooden pinwheel that caught the wind and spun in dazzling colors. He held it up like it was magic, smiling softly, and Claire caught Paul watching them both, his expression less guarded now, no longer edged with suspicion. Another evening they made dinner together at Claire's home, pasta, garlic bread, a salad Adam helped arrange with quiet focus. Afterward, Paul washed the dishes while Claire dried. The small domesticity of it made something bloom in her chest, warm and fragile and new. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. They didn't talk much about the past anymore, not because it didn't matter, but because something else mattered more now, what they were building, a shared space, a rhythm, a family, not defined by what had been lost, but by what could still be made together. The morning sun filtered through Claire's kitchen window, casting warm patches of light across the worn wooden table. A vase of lilacs sat in the center, their soft scent filling the room, and the kettle on the stove began its slow, familiar whistle. It was Mother's Day, one Claire had never celebrated. Not really. Not for herself. She hadn't expected anything. She never did. Claire was just finishing her tea when she heard a knock at the door, not hurried, not tentative, just expectant. She opened it to find Paul standing there dressed in his usual windbreaker, hands in his pockets. Beside him stood Adam, clutching something carefully in his hands. "Hi," Paul said, offering a faint smile. "Good morning," Claire replied, her heart lifting just at the sight of them. Adam stepped forward slowly. He didn't say anything, but his eyes met hers with that quiet focus she'd come to recognize, thoughtful, deliberate. In his hands was a folded card made from thick white paper, a little lopsided at the edges, colored heavily in blue crayon. He held it out. Claire took it carefully, as though it might vanish if she breathed too hard. She opened it. Inside, the page was covered in familiar spirals, dozens of them, drawn in layers of blue and gold. In the center, a single red heart, uneven but clearly intentional, and below it, scrawled in careful, shaky letters, "For Claire." There were no other words, none needed. Her throat tightened. "Did you make this for me?" she whispered. Adam nodded once, just once. Then he stepped closer and without hesitation leaned gently against her side. Claire wrapped her arms around him, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, tears pricking at her eyes. Paul looked on from the step, his face soft, his posture relaxed in a way it rarely was. He asked to do it, picked the crayons himself, didn't want help with the heart. Claire smiled through the lump in her throat. "It's the most beautiful card I've ever received." And it was. Not because it was perfect, but because it was his. Because for the first time in her life, on Mother's Day, someone had said, "I see you," without ever needing to say it at all. The cemetery was quiet, tucked beneath a canopy of old trees whose branches arched like sentinels over the narrow gravel paths. Claire walked slowly, a small bouquet of fresh lilacs in one hand and a folded note in the other. The morning air was cool, the sky a soft, cloud-dappled gray. She hadn't been here in weeks, not since everything had begun to change. David's grave was near the edge, beneath a sycamore whose roots lifted slightly through the earth, like the tree itself had grown restless with time. The headstone was simple: his name, the dates, and the words, "Forever steady, forever kind." Claire knelt beside it, brushing away a few fallen leaves before placing the flowers at its base. For a long moment she said nothing. She just sat with him, letting the stillness settle like it always had in their home. Then she unfolded the note and stared at it, not to read it, but to steady herself. "I should have told you," she said softly. "I almost did, more than once. There were nights I'd lie awake next to you and want to say it, but the words always got stuck." She paused, pressing a hand to the cool stone. "His name was James," she whispered. "You would have loved him. He's gentle and strong in ways the world doesn't understand. He doesn't talk much, but he knows. He feels everything." Her voice cracked. "And somehow he's back. After all this time, his name is Adam now. He has a guardian, a good one, Paul, and we're trying. We're making something new." The breeze stirred through the trees, lifting her hair gently across her cheek. "I've carried this guilt for so long, David, for giving him up, for not fighting harder, for keeping it from you." Her throat tightened. "But I think maybe it's time to let it go. Not because it doesn't matter, but because holding on to it won't heal what I lost." She sat in silence for a moment, her hand still on the stone. "I just wanted you to know. You were always my anchor, and I think it's time to be someone's anchor again." Claire stood slowly, her eyes glistening. "I'm not lost anymore." The sun hung high over Maplewood Park, casting a golden shimmer over the leaves that danced gently in the breeze. Children's laughter rang from the playground, kites bobbed in the open field, and the faint smell of spring blossoms floated through the air. It was a familiar place, but no longer marked by silence or waiting. Claire sat on the bench beneath the old oak, her usual spot, but now it felt like theirs. A picnic blanket was spread out just a few feet away, anchored with juice boxes and crumpled napkins. Paul leaned back on his elbows, watching Adam as he moved slowly around the path with a piece of blue chalk in hand. He wasn't drawing spirals today. He was drawing lines, soft, deliberate paths that looped and branched like roads connecting one place to another. Claire watched him, heart full, her fingers idly brushing the edge of a book she no longer needed to hide behind. "Looks like he's mapping something," Paul said, his voice low and warm, beside her. Claire smiled. "Maybe he's showing us where we're headed." Adam looked up then, catching her gaze. He gave a small nod, barely perceptible, but enough. He reached out and placed the chalk between the two of them, a quiet offering. Claire knelt beside him and picked up the chalk. "May I?" Adam didn't speak, but he stepped aside, giving her space. She bent down and drew a small circle at the end of one of his roads, then another, next to it. And in the center, she pressed her thumbprint gently in the dust. When she stood, Adam looked at her creation, then at her. He didn't say anything, but he reached up and took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers with quiet trust. Paul stood too, watching them both with a softness she had come to know. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to lead. They were walking forward now, together. The park no longer felt like a place haunted by what had been lost. It had become something else. A beginning. A place where grief had softened into love. Where silence had become understanding. Where 3 lives, fractured, uncertain, had slowly, quietly, formed something whole.